Great. Well, Stan asked me to talk on investing full-time overseas. A lot of you guys have gone on medical missions and know what that's about. Today I'd like to talk about what might it look like to transition to being a full-time missionary, or in something that might be a little bit different than what you thought being a missionary looks like. So we're going to look at the spectrum of possibilities today. This is my family. They're back in Burundi. My wife Jessica, my daughter Elise, Micah, and Sam. And how did we get to Burundi? I can share a little bit of our story since Stan brought it up. We're part of a team currently of 3 families and 2 single women. We're about to add a few additions, and we'll have, I think, 28 Americans on our team. And a Canadian. Don't forget our Canadian friend. So how did we end up in Burundi? I grew up in Togo, West Africa. And as a missionary kid, I knew the hardest part about being a missionary. Anyone know? Anyone know the hardest part about being a missionary? The other missionaries. So the number one reason missionaries leave the field is due to conflict with other missionaries. So it was calling me back to the mission field as I went through my medical training, and I thought, hey, I should look for some other people that I'd like to spend the rest of my life with in a high-stress situation. So God brought that to pass during medical school. I met another missionary kid who's a general surgeon, and we hit it off, and we happened to be at the same church. We just kind of snowballed into one thing led to another, and now our team has six physicians, multi-specialty group, and we're all in Burundi together, serving together. So, very long story short. So, when we look at the world, the statistics are pretty amazing. The newer term for the developing world is the majority world. So, in the majority of blind people and people with visual problems live in the majority world. In fact, 9 out of 10 people who are visually impaired live in the developing world. So that's a pretty good reason to think about investing long-term, where the chunk of the need is. When you look at Africa in particular, it's about 1 ophthalmologist for every 1 million people. And that 1 ophthalmologist, his training is quite variable. There's some great ophthalmologists, and then there's a lot of ophthalmologists that have some pretty limited training. And most of those ophthalmologists all live in the urban centers. So in Kenya, for example, it has more ophthalmologists than most African countries, but most of them are all in Nairobi. And so that leaves, the 35 million people who don't live in Nairobi very underserved. And this is true throughout all of Africa and through most of the world. In fact, it's true in America as well. If you go to rural areas, it might be a lot harder to find eye care because most of us live in urban centers. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to what that means when we're developing ophthalmologists in the developing world, how that role of where most of these mission hospitals are very rural, but most of them are wanting to live in the city. So that's important to think about as we go forward. When we went to do a site visit to Burundi, those statistics looked even worse. There's only 1 national ophthalmologist doing eye surgery in a country of 10 million people when we went to visit in 2010. The situation's a bit better now. There's been 2 young Burundians who've come back from their training and have joined him. So with me, that makes 4 ophthalmologists for 10 million people, which we're getting there. So my question for you guys is, why wouldn't you go with the statistics the way they are? Why would you want to stay in America? Why would you want to stay in Europe? Why not go to the developing world where your skills can be used exponentially? So let's continue looking at this. As a missionary and talking with young people, the idea of calling is an important thing to talk about, and all of us should be thinking about that. And I really like what Frederick Buechner says about what is calling in life. How do we know our calling in life? And it's where these 2 things intersect. The place God calls you to is a place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. And I think all of us, we love doing eye care. I don't think there's too many ophthalmologists that don't love the job that we've been given to do, and we've seen where the world's great need is. So think about it. As you think about your life, I don't know how many of you have a kind of a vision for your life, or you're just kind of floating along and you haven't really thought about it. But Proverbs says, where there is no vision, the people perish. No vision, death. When you have a vision, hopefully inspired by God, that brings life. So God usually gives us visions that are transcendent, they're compelling, they're worthy, they're bigger than we are. They're worth dying for. So does your life have that kind of calling on it? And as we enter into that calling, we can maybe you're feeling a little bit guilty right now. That's not why we go and do these things. All right. Once you get on the ground, being motivated by guilt and fear, that God's going to punish you if you don't, go do some good work, isn't going to get you through to the end of the day. You got to keep coming back to the God who loves you unconditionally, who can keep filling you up with unconditional love, and that's really important. I think there's a lot of people that have been kind of pushed by guilt into missions, and it really has to be an overflow of God's love in your life. All right, so maybe some of you are thinking of the idea, how on earth would I possibly make this transition? So we're going to just take a few examples of probably some people you know and how they've done this. And you're going to see that God could probably use you even if you don't think, maybe I'm academic. There's no role for me in this medical mission. I haven't done surgery in 10 years, because I'm a researcher. You might think that God couldn't use you, but there's a place God could use you. I guarantee it. So as we look at kind of long-term missions, there's more and more discussion about, relief work versus development work. And I would say, short-term missions are really well set up to do kind of relief work. They can come in, you can do, your 200 cataracts or whatever. That's relief work. The longer you're on the ground, or the more times you go back to the same place, you can shift more into development work where you're investing in infrastructure on the ground. And you can even set up, though, your short-term missions, and this is a topic we can talk about more, to be more development-focused by partnering with people on the ground in a helpful way. But this is really a big advantage of being a long-term missionary, because you can really invest in development. But it didn't start out that way. Kind of the old-school missions model is, I go to a needy place, pick a place, it's going to work. You're going to take care of thousands of people over your career. You're going to be ministering in word and deed over those years. You're going to die. It was wonderful. You had a high-functioning program while you did it. Not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. But that's really a relief model. And so, when the missionary leaves, maybe there's political instability, maybe they just burn out, health issue. Our family had to leave the field because of my mom's health. Maybe the missionary dies or retires. That leaves a big, big vacuum where that missionary was if there wasn't planning ahead. If there wasn't a national fully trained to replace the missionary. Another really big factor is the missionary is usually, although we heard Lord Ian saying differently, usually the missionary is funded by the sending country, and the mission hospital, isn't paying their salary. And so when that missionary leaves, that leaves a huge financial hole if you're going to replace it with a national, because now you need to you have to have a salary to pay that national that probably isn't being funded from the West. And so this transition from mission-run hospitals to national-run hospitals is very expensive. It's an expensive transition, and a lot of hospitals go belly up in that transition. So we need to be thinking about that ahead of time as well. Because if you don't find another expat with their funding, maybe the whole thing goes down. And we've talked about, Glenn touched on some dependency issues, and talking about, can this thing function on its own on the ground long term? Those are some cons. Another con is when you come in and you have a lot of foreign funding. Maybe I've got a national ophthalmologist. I do. I've got Dr. Levi Kandecki in the capital city. And now there's this great American ophthalmologist, and all the people in the city are coming out to see me. And that's a big hit to his income. And so you can really hurt your national colleagues when you come into a situation. And that's a con no matter where or what model you're using, but something we have to really think about. My goal in Burundi is to have great eye care available in Burundi going forward. And if I come in and I break the legs of the ophthalmologists financially, and no one else wants to go into ophthalmology anymore, and I leave, and now I've left the situation worse than when I got there. So let's look at a few different models than the old school model. Some of you guys know the masked man there. This is Steve Anderson. He wasn't able to make it this year, but we'll call this the Stevie Wonder model. So what did Steve Anderson do? He was in private practice in Minnesota, and he said God was calling him to do a full-time service, so he left his practice, and he moved to, he was out in Borneo, right? He moved to Indonesia, and I think is there like 20 million people on the island of Borneo? It's a large number. It's the second most populated, or third most populated country on earth, I believe. So he went to Borneo to an existing mission hospital, and he partnered with a national ophthalmologist to set up an eye program there. So in this particular situation, he went in with a limited time frame. So he knew, in 5 years, I want to leave an eye program here in Indonesia. And so he knew a high priority was getting Dr. Eddie up and running and well-trained in that time. So I think maybe before he even got to Indonesia, Dr. Eddie was off training. Do you know Stan? So he was helping sponsor Dr. Eddie to get training in an eye program. And then he and Dr. Eddie came together at the mission program and worked together for several years to really solidify the program, establish how it would function. Taught Dr. Eddie how to do phaco, because that's a great revenue source for the hospital. And now he's returned back to the USA, and Dr. Eddie is leading a very successful eye program in Indonesia. So that was like a 5-year plus or minus kind of commitment. And now Borneo has a great functioning eye clinic that's doing outreaches to even other islands run by a national ophthalmologist. And now Dr. Steve can be back in the States, and he can continue to be a champion he's gone back into private practice, but he's still championing for Dr. Eddie, supporting from afar, and he makes frequent visits back there to continue skills transfer. And so we talked about sustainability, and in the last 10, 15 years, there's been a really big push to have all our programs be sustainable. And in eye care, I think it's much more realistic than in other fields of medicine. Once you start getting into general surgery, orthopedics, these other things, people have long hospitalizations, it's really much more difficult to be fully sustainable on the ground. And something I heard at a missions talk was the idea of being globally sustainable. And we're going to talk about what God's given us here in the U.S. and in the West. And let's think about how can we make programs that are globally sustainable within the global church. I think it's an interesting idea. So the Stevie Wonder model, I think it's great. If you're looking at retirement maybe in the coming years, what would you think of maybe spending 5 years to do something like Steve did? Or maybe you have a transition coming up in your career. Why not take a few years and do something like Steve? So the pros, like I said, if you have kind of a window of time, maybe it could be as short as 2 years or 2, 5, 10. This would be an interesting model for you to consider. And it really empowers the national ophthalmologist to carry on the program. And then it really creates a link for this idea of global sustainability between the Western partner who's invested several years there and is going to be a champion for the program back on this side of the pond. One of the downsides is you really have a lot riding on that national guy, which it's not a bad thing. It's just, there's risk involved. The national ophthalmologist doesn't quite make it or something happens and the whole thing is in jeopardy. And you really need to instill a vision. So Dr. Eddie, if this is going to go on, he's got to have that vision also to train like Steve trained him and keep the training going. And even with the national ophthalmologist, if you're over-subsidizing, you run into some of the pitfalls that the long-term missionary could have had. For me, I think this isn't a con. It's just really important. Discipleship and vision casting are key for the long-term success of something like this. Dr. Eddie's not living in a big city. He's out in a rural area. He has to pass on this vision of caring for the poor and taking a major pay cut to be doing what he's doing and to raise a family in rural Indonesia instead of in a big city where there's good schools. So this vision casting is really important, and if you don't do it, the program's not going to do well long-term. So that's the Stevie Wonder. We've got another very respected ophthalmologist that some of you know, Ben Roberts here, the specialist. So maybe you're a specialist, you're thinking, man, how could I possibly do specialty care in the developing world? It's too advanced. Yeah, it's better if I just stay home. Well, Ben's shown you how you can be in a field that demands a lot of technology, and you can make this happen. So Ben Roberts is a long-term missionary. Some of you in the room know him. And he's a retina specialist trained at Alabama. And he's been at Tenwick for going on 8 to 10 years now. So he joined an eye unit. Tenwick Hospital has been around for almost 80 years, but the eye program is about 24 years old. And he joined an existing program, but he's taking it to the next level. He's bringing subspecialty care to it. And so Ben is the only really affordable retina surgeon, and actually he's doing corneal transplants now too, that exists outside of Nairobi. So he actually has patients coming from all over Kenya to see him because the prices in Nairobi for private specialty care are very high. Under Ben's leadership, Tenwick has really moved from just providing relief work really into a major player in development work where they're training eye care providers at all levels. And he's now having residents rotate and get some retina experience during the residency. And the nice thing about the Tenwick model now is as a specialist, the Kenyans are really the ones providing the core eye care services, and they're doing it at a price that really, if Ben left, the Kenyans would be able to continue on the eye program with the money they're generating to do the cataract programs and things like that. So that's a beautiful thing to see. Ben's now taking the eye team with the Kenyan team. They go into South Sudan up to 4 times a year to do more relief work, and then they'll identify people to try to invest in at those places. Ben's created a place where if you are a retina specialist or a cornea guy or really whatever you are, you could go there and plug in and be high functioning. So it's definitely a place like Tenwick is a place subspecialists could consider going and being useful. Whereas if you come to visit me, I really couldn't use a retina specialist yet because we don't have a vitrector or a laser or any of that stuff. So what are kind of some cons of as you enter into a model that's highly developed? Retina surgery is really expensive. There's no way around it. You're looking at $300 to $400 probably to do a retina surgery versus anywhere from $40 to $60 to do cataract surgery. It's a big difference. And so Ben is largely subsidizing, along with other donors, the retina care being provided. Tenwick is a big mission hospital, and they're doing lots of training in all different specialties. So housing is super tight. So that limits some of his educational component because he just can't invite in whoever he wants, whenever he wants. And if at this point, Ben is critical to those subspecialty services. So those are relatively traditional settings, at mission hospitals. But I think more and more the wave of the future is going to be with us joining with academic institutions, and that's the role I've gone. But so if you the universities of Africa are training the next generation of eye care providers, and so for a while there was a German, for example, at the residency program in Nairobi at Kenyatta National Hospital. CBM, I believe, was sponsoring him to be there, and that's a great partnership to bring a Western in with the major training centers in Africa. It provides a lot of synergy in the training programs. Some of you might know John Cuppen. He's here. He and Scott and some others are going to be moving to Addis Ababa to start Discovery Eye Institute, and they're going to have a major focus on academic research in Africa. It'll be maybe one of the only major sub-Saharan eye research centers. And then our team is partnered with Hope Africa University's medical school. So I'm a professor in the medical school of Hope Africa. And we're hoping as we invest in these academic institutions, we're going to have high quality training happening in Africa for the long term. So the pros for the academic model is this is very, very development focused, almost to the expense of relief work at times. Academic centers can be not the most terribly efficient places in the world, as some of you know. But with time, there's exponential reward. And there'll be new discoveries made. There's not a lot of research that's been done on unique problems in Africa. And it creates some flexibility as an academic that you wouldn't have otherwise. Downsides, it's academic. If you're me, that's a major downside. It can move a little slower when universities are making decisions, things like that. And you're subject to, the chancellor. So other models, as we looked at kind of emissions models, those are places where you're gonna be supporting yourself. You're gonna be raising support. In academic models, could be a mix of those things, but NGO, maybe you can get a paid position. Although I doubt Mercy Ships had a paid position, but CBM's putting people into different places, although that's diminishing. But there are different non-governmental organizations you could consider working with overseas. So some possible pros are, like I said, paid position. These are usually high-functioning organizations that are doing a lot of good, like CBM. While they're providing lots of relief work, they're very focused on development work, and they have a huge, international base of funding for these programs. Depending on the NGO, some of the downsides may be, faith might not be so integrated into what you're doing. The bigger the organization, the less control you're going to have over your program. And then sometimes when these programs get so big, there's just a lot of overhead maintaining with things. Then as another model would be private sector. Maybe in the 1040 window, there's significant wealth in the 1040 window. There's often people looking for Western physicians to come in to fill certain positions. You could move into one of those countries and have a well-paid position. Maybe your family has medical issues or special needs that would preclude you from being in the middle of Africa. This could be a possibility for you, working at a state-of-the-art hospital in a closed-access country. It's going to be the most similar to kind of a U.S. practice that you're probably going to get in a missions model. And again, though, the con is you're not really running the show. You're going to be subject to an employer. There's going to probably be limitations on your expression of faith. which is fine. You're going to do that within relationships. And most of these places are very hot. So those are some just different ideas to get your mind thinking. How could God maybe use me as a full-time ophthalmologist, maybe in a way you didn't expect? This is just a little caveat. J.D. Bonner is here. Stan is here. It's kind of a variation of the Stevie Wonder. Stan was more of the Stevie Wonder model. But J.D. Bonner is a full-time U.S. ophthalmologist, but he goes back to the same institution in Uganda over and over and over and over. And so he has a long-term relationship with one academic center in Uganda and is able to invest in that institution. So that's another kind of, it's not truly a long-term missionary model, but it's a long-term investment in the same program. And I think that's really, really valuable as you develop, as a U.S. ophthalmologist, a program somewhere else. Don't go to 10 different places in 10 years. Go to the same place repeatedly. I think it's much more effective. And you can start to actually do development work instead of just relief work. All right. Some of you are maybe approaching that second career phase, that retirement phase, where you could plug in another 1 to 30 years somewhere else. One of our partners in Burundi, his name is Randy Bond. He's boarded in 4 different specialties. And he just retired from Cincinnati Children's. And he's come to Burundi to join us, but he's in the capital city at the university proper. And the dean was having a baby, so she went on leave, and they asked him to be the temporary dean. And then she decided she's not coming back. So now he's been the dean. You could go into retirement and become the dean of a medical school. So there's all sorts of opportunities for you out there. For younger people really considering being a career missionary, I highly would recommend you could look at some of these new international fellowships that are starting. University of Utah, Nebraska, I think Storm did, or maybe, do they have an international fellowship? Not anymore. Will's Eye is starting an international fellowship. Dean McGee, thank you. So they're starting to crop up at more and more places. And that would be a great investment of a year as you think about long-term missions. Also, I'd highly recommend, if you're thinking about longer-term missions, to spend the time to get formal M6 training in Nepal or in Yerevan, for example. I know Stan is working with folks in South America to establish M6 training programs, but it's worth investing in those. All right? So just explore these different models, and there's lots of different opportunities. We talked about that already a bit. So other issues that people have to deal with as they're considering long-term missions. There's kids' education. You got to sell your practice or your house. You're losing large amounts of income. Maybe you have to learn a new language, narrow skill set. Don't let that stuff scare you. It'll all sort itself out. Anyways, we have to keep moving a little bit here. So we talked a little bit about how you can have some unintended consequences. You can really undermine the national system if you're not thoughtful about what you're doing. And I have to have a discussion about what are my prices, so I'm not undercutting the national guys. So not over-subsidizing my care. Would I love to give dirt cheap, almost free care to the people coming to see me? That'd be great. And then no one would go see the national guys. So they would come see me every time. Then let's just jump down to the last point. I think sometimes it's tempting to say, I'm in this rural area. Maybe I can fudge my kind of standards a little bit down because it's a slippery slope. It's easy to do. And I'd say keep your standards super high. I think we have some great examples, and for example, Himalayan Cataract Project and Fred Hollis Foundation, saying, why can't we do affordable phaco? And then saying, well, let's build a foldable lens ourselves so we don't have to pay, X hundred of dollars to do it. And really pushing that envelope of how can we bring high quality care at an affordable place. That's how you come up with innovation, as I think John was going to talk about. Keeping that high standard, but then finding out it looks impossible, how do we do it, and finding ways to do it. All right, that's just our team blog, if you want to follow our team story a little bit more in the future. All right, we can, let's just move to the developing nationals talk. And then we'll do questions at the end. Okay. All right, great. All right, this next talk. All right. No, we're gonna have it. All right. So as I told you, our team is in Burundi, and we're partnering with a medical school there. But to decide to move to Burundi, our team had to really decide what are we all about as a team. And this is what our team decided before we decided where we would partner long term. And our team's vision is to glorify God through medicine by seeking to bring healing and wholeness in word and deed to the underserved of Africa, and to train African medical professionals to do the same. So this is at the heart of what our team is doing across our specialties. For you guys, your eye care, so let's talk about what does it look like to train in Burundi. So some of you might be thinking about starting programs from scratch, so we're going to use what we've done in Burundi as a model for you, kind of hands-on model of how do you go into a place, there's no eye care, and from the 6 months ago we started, get to where we are today. So in January, our official start date, I had 0 staff, and the administration met with me and said, what do you need? And I told them I need 4 staff. It'd be great if at least 2 of them were at least at a level of nursing care, and then 2 guys that can work. And if they speak some French, that would be great, because where we are, there's very little education, so most people just speak the tribal language, which I spent 3 months studying it, but it's going to be a lifelong process, being able to communicate in Kirundi. So January 2012, no staff, no patients, no surgeries. We're literally starting from nothing. The administration did all the hiring for me. So one tidbit is trust your national partners. When you're new to a culture, you have no idea what's going on. If I had hired these people, that unit would probably be a mess right now. But I let my nationals that I trusted do the interviews, look at the CVs, and they actually gave me a couple extra people, which was very nice of them. Now we've seen about 2,500 patients together and just under 200 surgeries since we started. So they're doing a great job. So how do we get there in 6 months? So this is the eye team. We found some old glasses and took a picture together. But first we had to build a team identity. This is really, really important. And the great thing is, in ophthalmology, we're doing fantastic work, so it's easy to get people excited about it. So we had to really have a team vision. And what is our vision? Our vision is to have Burundi have the highest level of eye care in sub-Saharan Africa, and to do that by building a tertiary eye center that's training. And our mission is to eradicate avoidable blindness in the Great Lakes region of Africa, around all the Great Lakes. That's what we want to do. And I'm talking to guys there's never been eye care in their part of the country before. And so that's a pretty big vision and a pretty big mission. And then I showed them videos of people getting their patches off after cataract surgery and got them really psyched to be eye care providers and how they're gonna change the country, and they are. And then we spent 2 weeks just going through teaching, starting with basic eye anatomy, the basics of eye care. We did 2 weeks of lectures basically for the staff. But you got to keep developing those people, because when I started, I'm the only one who can see patients, but there's quickly more patients than I can see. So we really have to start developing individuals on the team. So we get a team identity, and now we start kind of individualizing training for each person. So the leader of our squad here is Toney. Toney just graduated from medical school, and his dream is to be an ophthalmologist for his people who have, most of them have never had access to eye care. All of the eye care happens in the capital city. It's 1 million people. These people are rural based. They're very scared of the city. Most of them would never go to the big city to get eye care. One, they couldn't afford it, and the big city scares them. And so his vision, he's from a rural area, is to be in the rural area providing eye care. So how are we going to get Toney? How are we going to get him there? How many minutes we got? Let's see. I understand. All right. So we won't go into the story of how he got the name Captain KURIMA, but you can ask me later. Anyway, so the first thing I found out that it's nearly impossible to refract a Burundian. It's the most excruciating experience you've ever imagined. So I quickly said, Toney, you have got to do this. So the first thing I did is I taught Toney how to refract. Toney hasn't come out of the refracting lane since that day. I basically set him in there, and he hasn't come out because it's so painful. He's sitting there all day long trying to refract these people. Whew. And dealing with the one guy in the country who can get us glasses, also extremely painful. So I said, Toney, you're refracting. Why don't you take care of procurement for glasses as well? So he's kind of running our kind of optical side of things. And I've given him basic science books on optics and refracting. He's learning some surgical skill. He's now doing eviscerations himself. And immediately I put him in charge of doing lectures to medical students. I have a large volume of medical students coming through. So he's in charge of teaching anatomy and optics and kind of the core stuff to the medical students. And then just recently, the hospital has made him the assistant director of the clinic. So he's been given responsibility. He's given appropriate titles, and that's great. That brings dignity, and he's really taking charge, and it's a beautiful thing to see. But ultimately, for the program, we need to send him off to do formal residency training so that he has the respect of his national colleagues and is appropriately credentialed to eventually run the program himself. So these are just different ways we've tried to help Toney mature rapidly by giving him hands-on training, lots of books, empowering him with responsibility, leadership, and actual titles and pay that go along with that. And then our dream is to get Toney into a formal residency program in the coming year. So the next guy is our most highly trained nurse. He also just graduated from nursing school. And his dream in life is to be have a professional ophthalmic degree of some kind. So that's what we're working on. Elysée is in charge of the theater, so we've spent time with him working on how do you run a theater. An OR. It's the British. And again, working on his basic skills. He's a talented guy. He's seeing a lot of routine patients for me that I don't have to see anymore. And then he's helping me with the teaching responsibilities by teaching how to use an ophthalmoscope and a slit lamp to the medical students. And then what we did is we brought down one of the surgical technicians at Tillamook who's extremely talented. She came down to spend about a week and a half with us and to train Elysée how to run an OR. And that doubled our output in just a week and a half, that little bit of training from an experienced person to our new person. And then so things to legitimize his role as an eye care provider. I've recently purchased the AAO Certified Ophthalmic Assistant course for him as a start to get kind of a certificate in eye care. And then eventually I think we'd like to send him to Nairobi or somewhere where they have an ophthalmic nursing program. In Africa, and really anywhere, even here, legitimate training certificates are important for the program as you go forward. Even if the quality of that program isn't maybe where you'd want it, those things are important to have, those kind of legitimately trained people, and not just kind of on the job. So then we got the other staff. Josiane, she's a 2-year grad of a nursing program. She's kind of in charge of pharmaceuticals and procurement, and she does all the kind of pre-op eval and the retrobulbars and circulates in the OR. Then I have 2 pastors. Wish we had a little bit more time, but these guys are great. Josiane is an orphan from the war. Pastor Emmanuel on the right, he's been a refugee for 18 years in Tanzania and kind of educated himself on the run. And he's trying to get his family back united in Burundi. So we're trying to help him build a house so he can do that. But these guys are so hardworking and eager to learn, and they all play a critical role, and we got to invest in those. So one thing we're doing for this level of staff is we're going to teach them how to type so we can start using computers, because Africans like bureaucracy, so they have to write everyone's name and what hill they live on, and just tons of information about every patient for the government. And then they have to copy that into like 5 different books. And so we're going to try to teach them how to type so we can do it once and be done with it. And then you've got folks in the background, like the cleaner. This is our cleaner, Noziat, and she works incredibly hard. And I'll tell you what, the one person I did hire was the cleaner. He was a guy who kind of just latched onto me when I got to Burundi. And I kind of went to admin and said, what do you think if we make him my cleaner? And they said, all right. And it was a disaster. So the one guy I kind of decided to hire kind of more directly didn't work out. And so administration was gracious. They moved him out of my service into a different area of the hospital. So now they have an employee they didn't even ask for. And got me a different person who understood what it meant to clean an eye unit. So listen to your national partners. So kind of moving on and how we develop folks. The places we want to bring ICAR are these very rural places. How many of you live in a rural place where there's no school for your kids, there's no recreation, there's no nothing? Not many of us live in those kind of places or would consider it. And we're asking our national partners to do that, professionals to do that. So a huge part of this is discipleship. Why would we do that? Because we serve a God who did that for us. And so mutually discipling each other is a wonderful thing. These guys have lived through a 13-year war. They have so much to teach me. So twice a week we do our staff devotions, and then the other days we have devotions with all the hospital staff. I'm hoping to start up a Bible study with the staff who would like to. And we're not quite there yet, but in Kenya what we did is we worked on Bible storying as a way to evangelize, and I hope to do that with our team here in Burundi as well. And then it's key to take retreats together and hone your vision as a team. Those are important things in discipleship. And then you got to love and appreciate people as you develop and bring them into leadership. So we like to do things like once a week we do chai together, and my wife bakes something yummy for them, and we have a nice break. Some of these guys have never seen a movie before, so show a movie on holidays or whatever, and it's a great time for them, and it's exciting to watch them watch the movie. The one pastor is trying to reunite his family. How can I come alongside them in their personal lives to be a help? And advocating for them for appropriate pay, and our staff work way longer than the other staff of the hospital. Making sure they're getting reimbursed for the work they're putting in, and just doing simple things like getting team shirts. So we all wear the same polo shirt with a Kabui AI clinic on it. That stuff's huge for team building. Just little things, and they really respond to that kind of love and care. Another big part of development, though, is these academic things. So I'm teaching an ophthalmology course. It's 45 hours long for a medical student. Who has ever heard of such a thing? But this is the government requirement. And then they have to come back and do another 2-week rotation with me as a 6th-year medical student. Then I've got nursing students and optometry students, students coming out my ears. But getting back to this idea of how, once we train these guys, once we have a fully trained ophthalmologist, how do I get him to come and stay with me? And I think finding someone who's local, who cares deeply about the care of his local people is a great way to start. If you choose a city kid who's had the best education in the country, who's always lived in the city, chances after you invest, major money and time into him, that he's going to stick out in a rural area, probably not super high. But if you find a country kid who's bright and intelligent, that really has a heart for his home area, chances are higher he's going to come back after all that investment for his people to partner with you. And you got to have housing for these people. You need to create education systems for their children. You got to find money to pay them, and the more sustainable the program is, and having reasonable fees, the more you can help with that without having to get so much outside funding. And you just have to have basic things like recreation, and obviously the most important thing is the wife's got to be happy, or the spouse has to be wanting to do this as well. Although in Africa, a lot of times the spouse stays in the city and the spouse works in the rural area. Which isn't the model we want. We'd like to have the whole family out with us. Right now, we're the only professionals that live rurally. All the African professionals, their families all live in the capital, and they commute back and forth for 2.5 hours. So they come out for the week and then go back to the city on the weekends. As your program builds, like where a Tenwick is at right now, you got to start looking beyond your own walls. And how can you invest in the professionals that already exist? How can they exist? How can we help the professionals in Burundi? How can I invest in the other ophthalmologists? I can invite them in to do phaco training so they have revenue source. We can kind of help them build their skill sets so that there isn't such a big disparity between the care I'm giving and the care they're giving. Ideally, I would love for all the national ophthalmologists to be just as good as I am and be competing for patients just as, be giving just as good of care. And maybe there's a way I can even give them a leg up on me. That would be great. Doing CME conferences for them, bringing in maybe specialists to do conferences on retina or cornea, whatever it might be, et cetera. So as we talked about, as you invest in these folks, you do have to think about the money down the road. How do I pay them? How do I make a career for these guys serving their people? We don't have time to get into how we do that, but that's all right. So takeaway points, you got to light a passion in people for what the vision is. And it's pretty easy in eye care. So do that from the beginning. You've got to have a team that works together. And then within that team, equip those individuals for their specific roles. Firm believer that those key players need professional credentialing for the long-term program. Start delegating leadership as soon as you can, or even before you think you can. Get them in those roles and taking charge. Encourage, disciple. Never work alone. Always have someone learning while you're working, and then get the finances in order to transition the program. So, thank you.